With the latest agriculture news from across the state and nation, it's time for the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. Here's your host, Sabrina Halvorson.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us this morning on the AgNet News Hour. Coming up later, maximizing the value of available farm labor in the short term. We'll have that coming up later on in the show, but we start today with livestock news and the Beltway Beef Program from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. Here's Hunter Ehrman.
Well, hello and welcome back to another episode of NCBA's Beltway Beef Podcast. I'm Hunter Ehrman. Well, in recent weeks, we have heard some news that the U.S. Department of Defense is considering funding some research into lab-grown protein. Joining us more for an update on this is NCBA Senior Director of Government Affairs, Sigrid Johannes. Sigrid, what's the latest?
So there is a bucket of money, as it turns out, over at the Department of Defense that is directed to funding research into lab-grown meat projects. How we discovered this is there's a series of public-private partnerships called Manufacturing Innovation Institutes. There's 9 in total that the DoD puts money towards to come up with sort of novel technologies, materials, things that are in the R&D phase that they might need to use in the future for defense purposes. One of those manufacturing innovation institutes is called BioMade, and BioMade put out a solicitation for projects, a call for proposals, basically, to develop lab-grown meat for military rations in the future. They put that out last month, just a couple weeks ago here in May. And the total pot of money that is available for this purpose is $500 million in total. That is a lot of money coming out of our defense budget to develop lab-grown meat for our folks in the armed forces. So as you can imagine, NCBA members, our allies on Capitol Hill, and quite a few folks from the defense community as well, national security community, were pretty alarmed to hear that.
That seems like an awful lot of money when we have perfectly good beef right now being raised by farmers and ranchers. Why do you think the DoD is pursuing this route?
It's tough to say. Because there's certainly no shortage of wholesome, nutritious protein being produced by our farmers and ranchers, as you pointed out, Hunter. Last year, in 2023 alone, U.S. cattle producers produced more than 27 billion pounds of beef. That is a lot of very nutritious, high-quality, and not to mention delicious protein that we can provide not just to the military, but to our schools, to American consumers, to folks in the grocery store and in the restaurants, and to millions and millions of consumers around the world. What is so baffling about this is, of course, food security is important. National security, hinges on being able to feed your people and feed your military. But DoD seems to be hunting for reasons, trying to, kind of solution in search of a problem, if you will, to find ways to explore this lab-grown protein avenue when we're not suffering from a protein shortage in the United States. It really feels like they're grasping at straws here to find a reason to fund these projects. That 27 billion pounds of beef, that doesn't even account for all the other proteins that we produce in the U.S. too. Obviously, we would say beef is certainly the most wholesome and the most nutritious and far and away the most delicious, but that's not even counting all the billions of pounds of chicken, pork, eggs, and whatnot that we have also available from U.S. agriculture. So really, when you look at it in total, the livestock sector in the United States and its tremendous productivity, with also, I might add, the best environmental footprint in the world, that's a pretty baffling choice to say that that's not enough and turn towards these lab-grown sources.
Tell us about how the federal government is trying to fund some of this research.
So that pot of money, that's $500 million available for project proposals that will be coming in the next few months here, and then DoD will have to sift through in BioMade and decide which ones they want to fund. I believe each individual project is capped at $2 million, so that could be quite a few projects coming out of that total bucket of $500 million. But what is also very interesting about this, well, there's two things really. Number one, that $500 million is coming in part from the money that we send to DoD for the purposes of keeping our nation safe and making sure that we have the most effective and the most well-equipped military in the world. Where lab-grown meat R&D sort of fits into that, I couldn't tell you. I think that's a pretty interesting and pretty odd choice of purpose for these defense funds that Congress has allocated to that purpose. But the other part of this that's interesting is that these companies that are developing lab-grown meat, which is extremely expensive, by the way, are receiving a lot of private investment. There's quite literally hundreds of millions of dollars flowing to into these companies from big dollar private donors and investors, this sort of usual cast of characters that you would expect, people who are interested in seeing where this goes and they're making an investment. And listen, that's how the market works. These are very new products. They're extremely expensive to produce. There are a lot of question marks still hanging over their nutritious value and hanging over their environmental impact. I think it's interesting that we don't have a life cycle assessment for any of these products yet, the way that we do for beef or another livestock animal. But at the end of the day, these are not companies that are struggling. These are not companies that are hurting for lack of funds. There's plenty of funds going to them. They're just it's a really energy intensive and capital intensive product to make. So we're still a few years away from these being broadly available in grocery store shelves. I mean, most Americans will have noticed that by now. There's a lot of headlines around these products, but it's not like you can go to your local grocery store and buy them yet. And there's a reason for that. They're expensive. They're hard to make. They're ultra processed. There's just a lot of sort of unproven aspects of this product that haven't really been test driven with the average American consumer yet, but somehow DoD thinks it's okay to sort of run that product and test it on our men and women in the armed forces, who obviously in many cases don't get to choose what they're going to have for dinner that day, but they're getting served this product potentially in the future.
You're listening to the AgNet News Hour. We continue now with Beltway Beef from the National Cattlemen's Beef Association.
So, Sigrid, what has NCBA done to push back on this decision from the DoD?
Well, in addition to a lot of outcry from cattle country, we had quite a few of our allies on Capitol Hill who were very upset about this. So both from big ag producing districts, but also from military districts, places where they've got a lot of active service members, a lot of veterans, there were plenty of folks interested in shutting this down. Our first sort of plan of attack was through the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act. That recently moved through the House. It is still in the process in the Senate, but we've got folks who led efforts on both sides there to amend the NDAA to prevent this money going out from DoD towards lab-grown meat projects. Like I said, the House, that's kind of a done deal, but in the Senate, we've got a live ball there, and that effort is being led by Senator Roger Marshall. The other big area here where we're focusing is defense appropriations. That is still very much a live ball on both sides. And we have a couple different folks in the Senate interested in that. But on the House side, we're really looking at Congressman Don Bacon from Nebraska, a really tremendous ally to the cattle industry, a veteran himself, somebody who is very worked up about this issue, and rightly so. And he immediately went to bat to try and take this down in the defense appropriation space. And we really appreciate his leadership there.
I think it really speaks volumes that Congressman Bacon, former Air Force general before he was in Congress, is really leading the effort on that. That certainly sends a strong message.
I think it does. I think it does because, it's no secret that you can't effectively fight a war or keep a nation safe if you're marching on an empty stomach, so to speak. The food that we provide to our armed forces really is critical. It's not just a matter of preference or, of fads or sort of the whims in D.C. Obviously, those winds can change pretty frequently. What's considered in vogue and what's not. Those things come and go. But at the end of the day, nutrition is important, and nutrition is a key component of our national readiness and the effectiveness of our military. And I think Congressman Bacon and a lot of the other folks who have military backgrounds in Congress really appreciate firsthand the fact that the diet of our armed forces is not the place to run an experiment when it comes to a highly processed and very sort of novel and new source of protein that really can't hold a candle at this point to the efficiency, the output, the volume of production, and certainly the quality and the environmental impact of your traditionally raised proteins like beef that are coming from our American farmers and ranchers.
So, Sigrid, how can farmers and ranchers get involved and share their perspective on this issue?
Well, I would strongly encourage anybody who has members of Congress on the appropriations committees, either in the House or the Senate, to call up their delegation, make it known how much you oppose this funding going to DoD for this purpose, and voice your support for Congressman Bacon's amendment. That is an amendment to the Defense Appropriations Bill, being led by, again, Congressman Don Bacon, and just reiterate to your congressional delegation that you support that effort. We do have bipartisan interest in this, I will say, so this is something that crosses party lines. It crosses ideology in many cases. Americans want to support our military, and they want to make sure that our armed forces are getting the best quality food that they can. So this is an issue with a lot of broad appeal to it, and I would strongly encourage folks to call up their delegation in support of Mr. Bacon's amendment.
Well, Sigrid, thank you so much for the update today.
Thank you, Hunter.
This has been another episode of Beltway Beef.
This segment is brought to you by Live Earth Products. To get to know a little more about Live Earth Products, we're talking on the phone today with Vice President Russell Taylor. What about humates in animal feed? When can you add humates to the animal feed, and what is the benefit of that?
So the interesting thing about animal feeds is just like the fertilizer side, there's actually a lot going on in legislative processes. So there's an act out called the Innovative Feed Act. And currently, you can't include things in animal feed that are giving you other benefits besides nutritive benefits. Let's say, for example, you had a cow that was eating a product that reduced its methane emissions, those enteric gases that are caused just in the natural digestion of a ruminating cow. You can't claim that those products do that benefit. So hopefully people will get involved and say, look, the Innovative Feed Act is necessary and should help farmers. Other benefits of feeding humate is obviously first to reduce enteric gases. But the second one, these are old plant materials. So those plant materials are rich in trace minerals. So not only are you getting something that's going to help the digestion of the animal, you're also getting an abundant supply of minerals. So that is the main reason farmers are currently including in their animal feeds.
This is all fascinating, but it can be hard to retain some of this information when you're hearing this on the radio or through the podcast. So is there someplace online, or where can our listeners go and get more information?
Well, the good news is the acts I mentioned, like the Innovative Feed Act and the Plant Biostimulant Act, are publicly available through Congress. You can actually go look at those acts. They're on the website there. The other information you can get is directly through Live Earth Products. So if you go to liveearth.com, contact us. You can contact us and our agronomy team. And we're happy to go over any details, questions about how to use these products, how they fit your farm program, how to use them as a tool to implement conservation practices such as nutrient retention, water conservation, and improving soil health.
To get to know more about Live Earth Products, you can visit them online at liveearth.com. That is spelled LIVEARTH.com. Don't forget, if you've missed any of our morning shows, or if you simply need to catch the news at a different time, you can subscribe to our podcast and have statewide agriculture news at your convenience. All you have to do is search for the AgNet News Hour on your favorite podcast downloading app. That's AgNet News Hour, and it's available wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. This is the AgNet News Hour. We will be back in just a moment with more agriculture news. Coming up in a few moments, we'll have today's This Land of Ours report, but first, more of the day's agriculture news. And with today's AgNet West headlines, here's Brian German.
After months of discussions among California's government officials, labor advocates, and businesses, an agreement has been reached to reform the Private Attorney General Act. The reform aims to help workers get fair compensation for labor claims while reducing unnecessary lawsuits that harm both employers and employees. The core elements of the reform include increasing the employee's share of penalties from 25% to 35%, requiring employees to have personally experienced the violations, and capping penalties for employers who proactively or reactively comply with the labor code. Additionally, the reform seeks to protect small employers by expanding the right to cure process, improving the enforcement of labor claims by expediting the hiring in the Department of Industrial Relations, and giving the courts more discretion over the scope of claims and evidence. A study by Flock Freight and Drive Research highlights significant inefficiencies in the trucking industry. The report, titled Wasted Space, Wasted Dollars, the Economic Impact of Inefficient Freight, shows that 43% of truckloads were partially empty in 2023, wasting an average of 29 feet of deck space. That translates to 25% of truckloads moving completely empty, leading to both economic and environmental concerns. The study also reveals hidden less-than-truckload shipping costs, including $6.3 million annually in damage and loss claims for enterprise shippers, along with unexpected fees and management time. Exiting a deflationary phase, the report shows the industry facing economic impacts in 2024, with nearly 91% of shippers increasing budgets by 1 to 10% to adjust. Farm labor availability is expected to continue being an issue in the years ahead. Roland Fumasi with Rabo AgriFinance said improving technologies will be an important short-term solution to labor challenges.
Ultimately, it's going to be about better technology. We're close in a lot of areas, for example, to be able to harvest even more of the horticultural crops, the specialty crops, the perishables mechanically. And many of them we're not quite there yet, but we continue to get closer. There's great collaboration and research going on within the industry to find those solutions. So technology will be part of that. There's an interim step there, right? Ultimately, in some cases, you'll be able to replace labor with technology. But in the meantime, we need to continue to adopt practices, technologies, growing system changes that allow the labor that we do have to be that much more efficient.
The National Cattlemen's Beef Association and Public Lands Council have expressed appreciation for the action taken against the Biden administration's Phase 2 National Environmental Policy Act. The Phase 2 NEPA rule was published last month by the White House Council on Environmental Quality as part of an overall strategy to reverse NEPA reforms from the previous administration that streamlined processes for ranchers. In response, Congressional Review Act resolutions have been introduced in both the Senate and House aiming to nullify the Phase 2 rule. NCBA and PLC commended the action, noting that the administration disregarded congressional authority and increased inefficiency in NEPA processes. The resolutions seek to prevent the federal rulemaking process from becoming overly burdensome, thus allowing ranchers to complete conservation projects more quickly. The U.S. Department of Agriculture will be hosting a webinar highlighting the application process for the 2501 program, which helps provide training and technical assistance for farmers. USDA's Office of Partnership and Public Engagement is inviting community-based and nonprofit organizations, institutions of higher education, and tribal-serving organizations to join a webinar on Wednesday, June 26th. The 2501 program has helped reach underserved farmers and ranchers for more than 30 years, providing funding to allow organizations to conduct education, training, farming demonstrations, and conferences on farming and agribusiness. Applications for this year's 2501 program must be submitted through grants.gov and received by Friday, July 5th. More information about the webinar is available on the upcoming events page at agnetwest.com. I'm Brian German for AgNet West Radio Network.
The U.S. has just released an updated climate plan. That's coming up on This Land of Ours.
The Agriculture Department this week has joined more than 20 other government agencies to release an updated and huge climate adaptation plan.
It's a roadmap that essentially talks about the need for us to be conscious of the fact that the climate's changing, that it's going to cause challenges.
Major challenges. Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack told us it's a huge plan to make every part of the economy more resilient in the face of weather disasters caused by climate change.
For farmers, really it is about not only greater resiliency, it's also about greater opportunity, which is why we launched the Climate Smart Agriculture Commodity Partnership Initiative, where we're paying farmers to embrace climate smart practices, reducing their greenhouse gas impact and footprint, storing more carbon, and doing their share of reducing the risk that comes with whatever the harsh consequences are of changing climate.
And there are many of those, as we're seeing this week. Gary Crawford reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
We know the heat is dangerous for us humans, but it can also be dangerous for our pets. Gary Crawford has more.
Depending on where you live, you may already have had a severe summer heat wave, a time when people say,
"It's too darn hot. It's too darn hot."
So hot that it's dangerous for people to be out in it or to be stuck indoors with no air conditioning.
So if it's dangerous for people, it is usually dangerous for pets as well.
Something a pet expert says we pet owners should bear in mind. Coming up, how to protect your dog from what could be some deadly temperature situations on this edition of Agriculture USA. I'm Gary Crawford. If you haven't been living through this summer's heat wave, you for sure have heard about it.
The deadly heat and the bad air affecting close to a third of the country's population At least 13 people, unfortunately, have died in this weather. It was hard.
During severe summer heat waves, local TV and radio stations always issue those warnings to people about the dangers of the heat and talking about how we can protect ourselves by limiting outdoor activities, staying hydrated, wearing the right clothing, or just staying inside. So that's how you keep yourself safe from heat stress and heat stroke. And of course, if you own a dog or dogs,
Keeping yourself safe helps keep your pets safe too.
This from Agriculture Department veterinarian Dr. Dawn Fitzhugh. And she says it does not have to be near 100 degrees to become a serious problem for certain dogs. She says problems can start in some pets when it's 85 degrees out.
So when it gets above 85, most of the time we really want to pay attention to the heat, the humidity, and our pet's condition when they're out there.
Before taking our dogs out into the heat, Dawn says we should ask ourselves some questions.
Is our pet used to this type of heat? Are they overweight? Are they underweight? Are they older? Are they really young? So all of those things can come into play as to how our pets can tolerate the heat.
And certain breeds have more trouble in hot weather than others, and we'll get to that in a minute. But dogs in general are susceptible to heat stroke because, unlike we humans who have sweat glands all over our bodies to help cool us down,
Pets, for the most part, only really perspire or sweat, like dogs and cats, through some sweat glands in their feet.
which does not help very much. And so for dogs, their only cooling mechanism is this. Yes, panting. And for some dogs, that's not enough to keep them from becoming dangerously hot and dying from it. Dawn says that does happen even when the dog is accustomed to, say, 80 degrees and is okay with that.
But if you suddenly go from, say, an 80-degree temperature to now, might climb up over 100 with some of these weather changes we've been seeing, that's where it's extremely dangerous.
Because some dogs just won't cut back on running and fetching and such. They just want to have fun.
And so before we know it, we can slip into something really dangerous because they're not going to limit themselves.
And that's up to us owners to limit them and watch for signs of trouble. Dawn says certain breeds are more prone to heat stroke than others.
The Alaskan Malamutes who have that thick fur, they're going to be especially vulnerable. The dogs with the little pushed-in faces that are super cute, so like your pugs and your French bulldogs, those guys are going to be especially vulnerable when it comes to heat. So we want to be really careful with some of those dogs in particular.
No matter the breed, whether it's a big dog or a little one, there are signs of trouble that we should be watching for and guarding against. If the dog is usually a big player, lots of running and jumping, or even just likes to walk really fast, but then suddenly just stops and lies down,
then that's them telling you, hey, I've had enough here.
So if you can, get that dog back indoors where it's cooler. However, let's go back a bit outside. The dog may not stop playing or walking on its own and could soon show other more serious signs of a heat problem. Suddenly slow walking, maybe staggering, trying to walk.
Perhaps even vomiting, and they can have diarrhea that can even turn to bloody diarrhea. And so those things are an emergency. So that's where you want to get your dog to an emergency veterinarian for care.
And do it as quickly as possible. Better yet, Dawn Fitzhugh says, avoid trouble for you and your pet and spend as little time outdoors in this severe heat as possible. You've been listening to Agriculture USA. I'm Gary Crawford, reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington.
Potential changes to Canada's capital gains tax rate have farmers nervous. Dennis Guy reports.
Canada's latest federal budget has introduced proposed changes to the country's capital gains tax, which is set and collected at the federal level. If passed into law, changes would have a capital gains rate rising from 50% to 66% for individuals who realize a capital gain of more than $250,000 in a given year period. Canada's finance minister introduced the motion in the House of Commons, the first stage where legislation is tabled for discussion prior to a series of votes on the issue. The Grain Growers of Canada has raised concerns of what these changes would mean for farmers generally and specifically for intergenerational transfer sales of family farmland and assets. Kyle Larkin, Executive Director of Grain Growers of Canada, says that these tax changes could add another 30% on what has always been a relatively high capital gains assessment in Canada.
The government's looking at increasing the capital gains inclusion rate from 50% to 66%. For most farmers who have bought their farms in the 90s or the 80s and further back your tax bill, I can guarantee you, for most of them, we're looking at a 30% tax increase because of this capital gains tax increase.
According to the Grain Growers of Canada, an example calculation shows that under the proposed higher rate, the sale of a typical farm would incur a capital gains tax of about $5 million, which is about $1 million more than would have been paid under the lower inclusion rate.
If you're a 800-acre farm in Ontario, this is going to be about $1.2 million. An extra taxation of what you already have to pay. If you're a 2,500-acre farm in Alberta, you're looking at just over $1 million.
Grain Growers of Canada is lobbying the federal government to make some exemption measures for farmers.
Young farmers in Canada are already facing a pretty significant financial burden. They're already facing a hurdle of millions of dollars for those aging farmers. This directly targets their retirement planning. This capital gains inclusion rate change targets that directly and will take millions of dollars away from that retirement plan as well.
Typically, these changes won't affect farms on an annual basis, but their impact will be felt when a farm's assets are being sold. However, the more direct issue is how this will impact the younger generation's ability to buy out their parents' interests now that there could be a larger capital gains tax bill to be paid to government. Kyle Larkin of Grain Growers of Canada explains.
We hope that they backtrack this, respect what's already enshrined in law as it relates to intergenerational transfers. So when Bill C-208 was passed about 3 years ago, if it's intergenerational transfers, they should be able to get the original 50% capital gains inclusion rate and preserve that family farm that is the backbone of Canada's agricultural sector.
Reporting from Canada, I'm Dennis Guy.
This is the AgNet News Hour. We will be back in just a moment with more agriculture news. You're listening to the AgNet News Hour. Here is today's featured interview. Let's start out with your name and your title, please.
Yeah. So my name is Colin Swearis. I'm the president and CEO of the Western Propane Gas Association.
We are here today talking about propane use in agriculture. And can you tell me some of the ways that propane is used in agriculture?
How much time do we have for this? Okay, I'll keep it simple. What we've seen is propane is used pretty much in every sector of every industry in the entire country. Agriculture is no different. So from backup power generation to irrigation engines so that folks can water their fields, to wind machines to keep citrus and wine grape crops from freezing. That's where the predominant use of that is. But it's also space and water heating for folks who work on those fields, for folks who live on those properties. You've also got a lot of that energy going towards things like propane-powered tractors and propane-powered field equipment. So, pretty much anywhere you go at any point in the entire agricultural operation, you're going to find a propane-powered solution that is cleaner, cheaper, and more efficient than just about anything else you could provide in that same spot.
So California is kind of known for its, let's use the word quirky, regulations, difficult regulations. There are a lot of other words that we could put in there. But California is kind of known for its regulations. How does the propane industry fit into that?
It's actually interesting. We talk a lot with air regulators about how we're a solution to help get California off of its diesel addiction, how to move to a cleaner burning fuel. The nice thing is, even with fossil propane in California, we have the exact same carbon intensity as California's electric grid. Now, what does that mean? We could go into the grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule and get into the science of it. But the reality is that right now, if you are a consumer in California, you can transition from even electricity to propane, and you will have the exact same carbon footprint as that electric grid for a lot of solutions. What we've seen is there is a drastic need to improve not just the climate emissions from California, but our air quality emissions. Folks who have lived in California for a long time, I know you said earlier that you're a native Californian. There's a lot of folks who remember the days when, bad smog days, and it was, it wasn't a cloud cover, it was smog cover. California has taken drastic steps since those days to improve its air quality. Now what we're seeing is folks are going, okay, great, we've made huge gains. Now how do we squeeze those last few little bits in? And so what we're seeing is, even as, diesel is getting cleaner, gasoline is getting cleaner, propane is still cleaner than both of those things. And when you talk about a fuel that can be deployed pretty much anywhere and has about 1 million different uses in any different setting, when folks are going, okay, well, how do we take that next step to transition the energy economy of California to something that's cleaner and greener? Propane is serving as that solution that's available right now off the shelf immediately, provides instant gains at a very affordable price. And I think that's the next question that we have with a lot of regulators is, are there other solutions? There might be. They might be technically feasible. They might be achievable. You might even have a couple of solutions in some other type of fuel source or electricity that are available at scale, but are they going to minimize the harm to the consumer in terms of that cost? And more often than not, the answer is no.
So speaking of cost, that is always a big topic when we're talking about fuel of any type in California. How does propane compare?
So right now in Northern California, where we are, we're in Pacific Gas and Electric Service territory. PG&E is the largest investor-owned utility in the state of California, one of the largest in the country. They serve a little over 20 million Californians. Right now, if we were to stay here today and you were to plug your phone in and charge it from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m., you would be paying over 54 cents a kilowatt hour. That's 4 times larger than most other states of the union. It's more expensive than the state of Hawaii during their general, electricity costs. And that was for years, just because the island nation had its own constraints, the most expensive electricity in the country. So what we see right now is electricity in California is becoming incredibly expensive and also incredibly intermittent. We can generate that same electron using propane for half that cost. So when you're talking about transition energy, when you can burn propane gallons to generate electrons and it's cheaper than what you can get from the grid, that shows you kind of where California is at. Now, it's, if you've got a state that's using coal-fired electricity, it's going to be a heck of a lot cheaper than that, but is it going to be cleaner? And that's the issue we see in California is right now the electricity generation is skyrocketing in price. It's difficult keeping the lights on. Folks are worried about reliability, about continual operations. During peak demand, when it's hottest, is also when it becomes the most expensive. How do we balance that demand for electricity and energy, which is not going away, with something that is both affordable and also clean? And that's right in our wheelhouse as an industry.
What about reliability? And when I ask about reliability and I'm thinking about electricity, because I know that there are times when the electricity is not reliable. When the electricity goes out, can you still count on propane?
And that's the other biggest factor, other than price and accessibility, that usually brings people to our doorstep, is anywhere you can drive a vehicle that you could drop a tank, you've got an energy source handy. You don't need pipelines like natural gas. You don't need power lines overhead like electricity. The only other real comparable fuel source like that is diesel. And with diesel comes a whole lot more emissions. The reason why one of our fastest growing market segments is power generation is really in backup power generation. Folks who've invested a lot of time and money into either their homes or their businesses don't want to have to worry about flipping that light switch on or turning on that motor or starting, like we've seen with Fisher Vineyards here today, with starting that grape pressing and the bottling. The last thing you want is the lights to start dimming, flickering, and then cutting out. And so what we've seen is a lot of folks who want reliable, continuous power generation and have that demand. We're the only show in town that folks can take advantage of for the most part in the state, which is great for us. I like to tell a lot of folks, if the electric utilities we had in our backyard were better at doing their job, that market segment wouldn't be growing. But the reason it's the fastest out here in the West is because when you can't keep the lights on and folks need it and they want to do it cleanly and sustainably, propane is that solution.
All right. I think that's perfect, but is there anything else that you think our listeners need to know?
Well, I will tell the good folks across this country who are in ag land who are thinking about whether they want to transition to certain equipments or whether they want to go to, propane versus diesel or, diesel to electric or whatever. I will say we talk a lot about how California needs to be, the United States, I should say, needs to be, an environmental steward. We see a lot of things out of the Biden administration to that same extent. A lot of work at USDA is modeled on things we've seen here in California in terms of installation of dairy digesters to reduce methane emissions, more sustainable farming practices. We talk a lot about the need to have sustainable agriculture that is sequestering carbon and nitrogen as opposed to off-gassing it. If you're in a state outside of California and you want to know what your future looks like, I would strongly encourage you to talk to some of your colleagues in California, because sooner rather than later, even if you don't like it, what's happening here is going to come to a state near you soon, and it would behoove you to get ahead of the curve as opposed to sitting behind it.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks so much for your time.
You're welcome.
You're listening to the AgNet News Hour. Now for more news. High-profile races this election cycle may get the attention, but the annual elections of the USDA Farm Service Agency County Committee members is also significant regarding constituent representation. Rod Bain reports.
While most of the election focus in 2024 will be on the White House, Congress, state and local government races, USDA Farm Service Agency Administrator Zach Ducheneau reminds us of an important annual election process that is now underway.
So far as I know, the county committee is the only place where citizen stakeholders have an opportunity to weigh in on the policy deployment at a local level, ensure their interests are being represented.
And candidate nominations are being accepted now through August 1st for Farm Service Agency County Committee positions up for election.
The county committees are anywhere from 3 to 9 members. In some cases, we might have a couple of counties combined and they have a little bigger representation to make sure we're getting proper distribution. The county committee is going to weigh in on applications that are made for certain programs, help the local office make eligibility determinations, and really provide eyes and ears out there for national and state policymakers to help understand how the policy is landing in the local communities.
An individual can nominate themselves or another qualified candidate to run. A look at qualifications for potential county committee candidates include:
you only need to be eligible for a program to serve on your county committee. You don't have to be in that program necessarily. So we welcome broader representation, and we look at this as a chance to rebuild the county committees every year, 1/3 at a time.
The 1/3 total indicating the annual turnover of FSA county committee seats via election. The election process itself is one that continues throughout the remainder of the year. Administrator Ducheneau explains after nominations are submitted, ballots are mailed to eligible voters starting November 4th.
And then we've got a little window for ballots to get brought back in, and we seat them ideally by the end of the year.
More information about the FSA County Committee election process can be obtained at the local FSA office or can be found online at www.fsa.usda.gov. Click the Newsroom tab to find the link to County Committee elections. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
That's today's top agriculture news. I'm Sabrina Halvorson. Thank you for sharing your morning with us.
To get more information on the topics you heard today, visit AgNet West online at agnetwest.com. You can also stay connected by following us on our social media at AgNet West on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also find our broadcast team of Brian German and Sabrina Halvorson on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you for listening to the AgNet News Hour from AgNet West. AgNet West Radio Network, your primary choice for agriculture news.